Nancy Streeks Grasmick graduated from the Maryland State Teachers College at Towson with a bachelor's degree in elementary education in 1961. Dr. Grasmick served as a teacher and administrator in public education for 28 years before accepting the position of Maryland State Superintendent of Schools. She served in that role for 20 years. In 2012, she accepted the position of Presidential Scholar at Towson University, as well as a faculty appointment at the Kennedy-Krieger Institute. These are her reflections.
Dr. Grasmick, thank you so much for sharing with us your professional life, your training, your preparation to become a teacher at Towson University, and your long and illustrious career in education that followed. This will add significantly to our understanding of teacher education at Towson across time. And I guess the best place to begin is at the beginning. Would you share with us your early social context, where you grew up, what kinds of career aspirations you had, what you were thinking about doing post-high school?
I grew up in Baltimore City, in a very quaint part of Baltimore City called Dickeyville, which is a restored mill town in the western part of the city. And it was a lovely place to grow up. And I went to Baltimore City Public Schools all the way through, beginning at Windsor Hills Elementary School, and then an opportunity for an accelerated curriculum at a school that no longer exists called Number 49. And then I went to the all-girls high school, which was a magnet school, Western High School. And I was very dead set on being a trendsetter by way of being a pediatrician. That was my desire. I loved science, and I knew that I loved children, and this would just be the right combination. I had a very, very bad strep throat. I had a propensity for getting strep throats. And at that time, there was no testing for medication for the remedy for those strep throats. And so my doctor prescribed penicillin. And I took it, and the next morning I saw my mother standing over me with her mouth moving, but an inability to hear anything, and also some difficulty with breathing. And so I was immediately given intervention medically, and it was determined that I had a severe reaction to the penicillin. And so for all intents and purposes, the next almost year, I had diminished hearing. And initially, it was very diminished. I could not hear any conversational language. I was being treated for that while I was a senior in high school. I was a very social kid. And I found it very frustrating. Obviously, I could speak, but I couldn't hear what other people were saying. And I had not developed the fine art of lip reading at that point in time. And so as I was being treated, I was interested in knowing about people who had been deaf. I'd never encountered people in my life who'd been deaf. And so the interest focused on Helen Keller, the most famous deaf-blind person. But in a more important way, as I began reading about her, I became fascinated with her teacher, Anne Sullivan. And I saw Anne Sullivan as truly a miracle worker. And I thought, that's for me. I want to be that miracle worker. And so I want to be the new Anne Sullivan. And so immediately I shifted from wanting to pursue being a pediatrician to being this famous teacher of the deaf. And so I had a scholarship to a school affiliated with Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, the Clark School for the Deaf, which was a very prominent school for the deaf. But I was still undergoing treatment. I looked like I was 12 years old, even though I was 16 years old. And my family said, you can't accept that scholarship. And so my fallback position was Towson University, because I knew that it had prominence at that point in time as an institution for preparing teachers, and I wanted to be a teacher. Now, I knew that Towson did not offer anything that would prepare me to be Ann Sullivan, but I felt if I got the fundamental training as a teacher, then I could pursue the expertise in deaf education. And so I came to Towson University, and a little bit reluctantly, but also found a wonderful and supportive environment here. I was certainly recovering and was engaged in a lot of activities and found the teachers to be excellent. And it just stimulated and reinforced my desire to be an outstanding teacher. Then came the time when we were to do what was then called our student teaching. And so I was satisfied to have my first experience in what I consider to be a regular public school. And so I went to Arlington Elementary School in Baltimore City. It's a very large elementary school, very high achieving school. And I worked with a wonderful, wonderful mentor teacher, and actually had a great opportunity not only to observe that teacher working with students, but also to be very hands-on in terms of teaching. And so under her leadership, I actually had the experience of teaching children. We forged a relationship that was extraordinary. And when she got other student teachers who weren't as enamored of the children and working with them, she actually asked me to come back and demonstrate for them working with these children. And so I felt very privileged to be able to do that. But then came time for the second experience. And I was a little intolerant at that point. So I said, no, I want to go to a special school. And there was a special school in Baltimore City. I knew about it. I had read about it. It was the William S. Baer School for at that time called for handicapped children. And Dr. Baer had been a prominent physician working with children with polio. The school was named after him. But they had many disabilities represented in the school. And the one, of course, which was my focus, was the group of children with deafness. And so the college at that time said to me, you can't go there. We don't put student teachers there. We really don't have a mentoring system there.
How did you make this happen?
So I went to the dean, Dean Murphy, at that time, and I said, I am refusing to go to the second experience unless I can go to the William S. Baer School and work with deaf children. Well, I was so persistent that I think they thought, let's just quiet her and let her go. Well, I went, and it was a phenomenal experience. I had an incredible mentor teacher who engaged me in everything. I fell in love with the children and actually participated well beyond my student teaching experience, went to evening activities at the school, and just became totally engaged in that school. And so I decided that as opposed to immediately doing my graduate work, which I already assumed would be at Gallaudet University for the deaf, I would have some at least brief experience as a teacher in that school without really all of the expertise required.
Certainly.
But certainly because of my student teaching experience and how absolutely extraordinary it had been, I felt I could handle it. And so I was interviewed by Baltimore City, And they were a little surprised that I was going to take this leap of faith to go right into this school without having the master's degree from Gallaudet University. But I said, I'm going to do it, and I know I can do it, and I know everyone in that school is going to be supportive to me. And they selected me. And I began my teaching career there with a group of very, very profoundly deaf children who, at that point, some of them were multiply involved. It was very challenging, very challenging. But I had such an incredible support system. And so I'm grateful to Towson University because not only did I get all of the background and information I needed and experience I needed to be a really good teacher, they let me do something that was unprecedented in the history of the university. And so I became a teacher of the deaf without a large portfolio of background. So that motivated me to go on to Gallaudet University, where I achieved my master's degree. And then I was getting married, and so I decided that I was going to live in Towson. And it was with open arms that the Baltimore County Public Schools accepted me as a teacher. Again, I was working with deaf children at the Woodvale School, which no longer exists in Riderwood. And the full circle occurred when I got student teachers from Towson University, and I was the mentor teacher at Woodvale.
And was Woodvale for students with disabilities?
Woodvale was a small school for children with disabilities, and they range from children who had learning disabilities to children we would say today were autistic, to children who had severe communication disabilities. And they used a term at that time, beyond deafness, of children who had aphasia. That's a term we don't hear very much except with adult stroke victims. So it was very exciting, and I spent several years there and certainly served as that mentor teacher for student teachers from Towson University. So that was exciting. And then one of the supervisors for special education was going to take a sabbatical leave, and they decided that I should come on an interim basis and be that supervisor. So I worked across Baltimore County, working a lot with speech and language pathologists and also with teachers of many different kinds of disabilities. And then a special school was opening in Baltimore County. It was a model that was unprecedented. It had a full medical dimension to the school. So it had a dentist, a psychiatrist, pediatrician, occupational therapist, physical therapist, a neurologist. It was a full medical staff in addition to the teaching staff. It also was a diagnostic center for young children where there are suspicions of learning difficulties. Children were sent there to be evaluated, even though they weren't permanent students at the school. And then there was another interesting dimension because we were beginning as a country to think about early intervention for children with disabilities. There was an entire apartment that simulated a living apartment anyone would have. And parents would bring these babies into the apartment, and they would work with experts to learn parenting skills with children who had disabilities. How do you work with them? How do you stimulate them? What kinds of things should you be looking for? Because often the tendency for parents of children who were deaf would be to stop talking with them. They didn't have language, they couldn't hear. Why would you speak with them? And yet the importance of that level of communication was very significant. So it was teaching all these parenting skills. So I was the principal of that very impressive new school. I was very honored to do that. And in the first year, I had over 2,000 visitors from all over the world to see this integration of education and medicine. And in addition to that, it was exciting for me because, again, we had student teachers from Towson, which was Towson College at that time, but now Towson University. And I have to say that without exception, and I mean without exception, we never had anyone come to that school who wasn't well prepared by this university. And it was very thrilling to see the quality of education they were being offered, which was maintained from my memory of my own experience here. So after that, I was asked if I would consider being what Baltimore County called an area superintendent, which meant you had 32, 33 schools in a particular area of the county, and you were responsible for the oversight and governance of those schools.
So this is a true administrative post. This is not sort of Nancy Grasmick's special area of interest.
This expanded to every kind of education, from special education to regular education to gifted and talented, elementary, middle school, high school. And it was funny because I was assigned to the southeastern area of the county. And there were particular characteristics of the southeastern area of Baltimore County. That is, it was male dominated.
I see.
There were probably only 2 women out of these 32, 33 schools. So I remember going into, and I was young, going into my first principals meeting, which I was responsible for conducting. And these men, more than 30 of them, looking at me like, what are they doing putting this woman down here? We'll eat her alive. But as I began to forge relationships, because one of the changes I truly made from the central office, and I actually want to say this on the record,
absolutely,
was that almost everyone who was an area assistant superintendent in Baltimore County, and there were 5 of them, were males. And the philosophy had basically been, you're an administrator, you stay at Greenwood, on Charles Street, and occasionally you go out to the schools. Well, I had a very different philosophy. I felt I couldn't make good decisions if I wasn't spending the majority of my time in the schools. And so I was out in the schools constantly, forging relationships, understanding the circumstances of the students, the challenges of the principals and teachers, etc. So one of the most significant moments, which was not academic, was the fact that this group of 30 men went to a particular place after we had our principals meetings once a month. And it was a restaurant, and they would have lunch together. And so a year passed, and of course I was never invited to be part of that. And then one day, one of them came up to me and said, "We'd really like you to join us today for the luncheon." And I really felt I had arrived when I could join them in a more social setting, because I had participated in their banquets for the schools and all of the sort of academic things, but I had really never socialized because they didn't let me into that world. Well, after that, we really became great friends for all of them, actually. And it was a very telling moment when they invited me to do that. So then, after I served in that position, Dr. Dubell, who was the superintendent at that time, and an incredible superintendent, I can never thank him enough for all the things I learned from him, an amazing model of leadership. asked me if I would be the assistant superintendent for all of the instructional programs in the county. And so that was the associate superintendent. It was a very significant position because you are responsible for the entire instructional program, every dimension of it, from elementary through high school. So I agreed to do that, and it was a big leap of faith for me. But then I missed the administrative part of the schools. And because there was someone who was also quite excellent in terms of instruction, I decided that I would ask if I could go back and be the administrator, the associate superintendent for administration of all the schools in Baltimore County. And Dr. DeBell agreed to that. It was not out of unhappiness. It was basically that I just liked that idea of how do you manage every dimension of a school, and that was exciting to me. So he said fine, and I became the associate superintendent for the administration of all the schools in Baltimore County.
And what did you do in that position?
In that position, you have to deal with all the staffing of every school in the county, and you know there are more than 150 schools there were at that time. We're talking about a lot of schools.
Yes.
And you deal with every crisis problem, every parent complaint that can't be resolved at the school level. You deal with all the scheduling. You deal with who's going to have what special programs, how those programs are going to work, etc. And you have to work hand in glove with the instructional part of it. But it is a huge responsibility because you know, you keep the trains running for every one of those schools. You deal with, at one point, I was in that position as the person who had to be the expulsion officer. So when expulsions were determined and there was a whole hierarchy of steps, you were the final step. And I worked with the board of Baltimore County and sat and actually organized and had the hearings on every expulsion that rose to that level. Sometimes getting home at 1 or 2 in the morning, starting at 6:30 in the evening for those expulsions. And of course, families had attorneys that represented them. It was a due process kind of hearing. So I had very long nights, very long days. And I've always been a person who arrives early at work, so it was like 7:30 till often 1 or 2 in the morning. But it was a great experience because you began to really understand all the nuances of how difficult situations are handled, some poorly, some very well, how you can provide for students who've made a mistake. And we had certain rules established. They had to be out of the school situation if the expulsion was upheld for at least 2 semesters. They had to go to an evening school. They had to demonstrate real commitment to learning. And then we reviewed the cases and made determinations about those students being able to come back into school. So it was a very, very interesting experience. And you're talking about, you know, several 170,000, 180, 200,000 students where there's a potential for things going wrong.
Right.
It was also the time, and it doesn't exist anymore, when there was this very close relationship with the police department. And it was when we were very focused on drug and alcohol use in the schools. And so we had cadets. These were young people who were pursuing a career in law enforcement. And Chief Behan was the Baltimore County head of the police department. And we placed these young people, it was really in jeopardy if their identity had been uncovered. We placed them in selected high schools. Only I and the superintendent knew where they were placed. And they were entered as just a transfer student. And we had many cases of students using, bringing, exchanging drugs, and those were cases I had to handle.
And those students, those cadets that were put into the school, how old were they? Was that?
They were often 18, 19.
I see.
These were in high school.
Uh-huh.
So they didn't appear to be different
Right.
from some of our high school students.
Uh-huh.
And they had to integrate themselves into the school
course.
and build those relationships to identify students who were using drugs. It was a very tense thing because we were interested in protecting their safety, but also weeding out students who are using drugs illegally and contaminating the school environment.
Uh-huh.
So I
Ooh.
dealt with that for several years. And
this is in addition to
running everything. It was evaluating teachers that were going to be dismissed because they were not competent, had all those responsibilities, the dismissal of teachers, and really looking at principals and assistant principals who had to be demoted because of poor performance. That was all my responsibility.
tough job.
It was a very tough job, but a very rewarding job personally in that it was such an incredible learning experience. And to
Indeed.
have a mentor like Dr. Dubell and the support of an incredible school board, and there were changes over time that were made in the school board because they, had 2 terms and then
Right.
they couldn't be on the board any longer. So we had incredibly supportive school board members. So I dealt a lot with the school board, both through the expulsion hearings, through dismissals, through these cases where parents had very significant complaints, et cetera. So that led Governor Schaefer to identify me in some way. And there was a position at the state called the Special Secretary for Children, Youth, and Families. And what motivated the governor to call me and ask me about my interest was this was a position which dealt with every child-serving agency in the state of Maryland. Education, juvenile services, health, social services. And there were children who'd been placed in state institutions for a variety of reasons. And the state was being sued because these children had been identified as ready for release, but the state agencies had not cooperated in placing those children back into appropriate placements. And so it was a very high-profile suit. So he called me and he said, "Would you be interested?" I said, "I love Baltimore County, I'm not interested." But he was a very determined man. And he persisted in making this overture to me. So finally I thought, well, this would extend my experience. I really knew very little about the state. And so I decided to take the position. And I was in that position. I began in 1989. I was in the position for a year. I was able to forge a relationship with the secretaries of these various state departments, and we were able to allay the suit by way of doing the right thing for these children. So it was rewarding in that sense, and I certainly learned a lot about all of the services of all these agencies, as well as their challenges. And then one day, Governor Schaefer called me into his office, and he said, "Nancy, our Secretary of Juvenile Services has just left, And I said, yes, sir. And he said, and you're going to be the interim Secretary of Juvenile Services for the state of Maryland. And I said, but I have a position. I'm the special secretary. He said, oh, well, you'll do both jobs. And I'm the only person in the history of this state who's ever done 2 cabinet-level positions simultaneously.
At the same time.
So I said to him, but I don't know anything about juvenile services. He said, you'll learn. And then I said, but I've always dealt with a positive model. Education is a positive model. It's something good for children. This is a negative model. This is negative things happening to children. And he said, that's right, and you have the job of making it more positive. Well, little did I know that this was the time when in Baltimore County, the Charles Hickey School was going to be privatized by a bill that was being passed by the legislature. He said, you're going to go out and tell those 400 employees that they don't have a state job anymore.
Great.
And I said, I am. I don't know anything about this. He said, you'll do okay. Go ahead. Go out and tell them that they're not going to have a job. We're going to have a private provider. You're going to choose the private provider and put those people in those positions. So I went out, faced these 400 people, told them you won't have a state position anymore. I didn't have any police with me. I was just there myself. And I said, you know, I'm new. This is a decision the state has made, and I understand the circumstances that you're facing, and I feel total empathy for that, and I'll answer any questions that you have to the best of my ability. There was a severance package, and I became familiar with that, so I could at least articulate that part to them. So then we went through the entire selection process for a provider, which is what the law required. And there were a number of providers who wanted to take over this because they saw it as being very lucrative.
Of course.
And this was the hardcore place for juveniles who offended. And so I worked with someone I felt had a lot of integrity and credibility. And that was Father Sellinger, who was the head of Loyola at that time. And he was the most wonderful and helpful man. We had a lot of appeals to the Board of Public Works on people who didn't get the contract because it was a very lucrative contract. But Father Sellinger would accompany me to go down and meet with the governor why he should support this, and meet with, at that time, the treasurer, Lucy Maurer, and Louis Goldstein, and try to help them understand why we had chosen one provider over another. So that was sort of the highlight. But I learned a lot that impacted education. I went out to the Hickey School at night, and I went to see the young people who were in solitary confinement. And I spent hours with them, and I asked them 2 fundamental questions. You know, please tell me, why are you here? And there were 2 reasons. One, I was a school failure. I knew I was a failure by the time I was in 2nd grade.
Wow.
And I had no one who cared about me. And I said to myself, if I ever go back to education, I have to remember that we can't place children in the position of feeling like they're failures when they're 7 years old. We have to do something that's different to help these children. So that was a great learning experience for me. And then I got a call from Bob Embry, the head of the Abel Foundation, who was the president of the State Board of Education. We are looking for a superintendent, and we would like you to consider applying. And I said, well, I really never thought about this. And so he said, well, I want you to think about it. I want you to send your transcripts and credentials and all of that to us. And we want it to be clear that we're interviewing a lot of people,
Yes.
and you may not be the person selected.
Uh-huh.
Little did people know that, and they still don't know, the governor does not select the state superintendent. The State Board of Education does that,
Uh-huh.
and that has precedence for a long, long time.
Uh-huh.
That education should not be interfered with politically to the best of our ability. There should be an arm's length. So the state superintendent is the only person on the governor's cabinet who is not appointed by the governor and cannot be dismissed by the governor.
Uh-huh.
That has import for my own situation.
Indeed.
And so they interviewed me and they offered me the position. And with a lot of trepidation, I accepted the position. And
that was in?
that was in 1991,
Mm-hmm.
and I stayed in that position for 20 years, which was really quite a record. So I worked with 4 governors. I
Yes.
certainly worked with Governor Schaefer as the governor, an incredible governor. And then I worked with Paris Glendening, Governor Glendening, and we sometimes had differences of opinion, but generally we did a lot of exciting things together. It was the time of the tumultuous lawsuit in Baltimore City on funding, and where the mayor had total control of the city school system, and we made the change to have the city be more commensurate with every other jurisdiction in the state of Maryland as it related to education. And that meant a jointly appointed school board by both the mayor and the governor. And there were many other provisions which pulled them into compliance with all of the rules and regulations, which they had not been in compliance with. So, and it was a time of another lawsuit on special education. So it was unprecedented in the country that you had a circuit court judge in Baltimore City, you had a federal judge, and I can recall one day walking into the courtroom, which I became a familiar face in the federal courtroom, and they were measuring their chairs. Were they equal in terms of their height? Because everybody had to be equal. The funding case was settled, so the circuit court judge no longer was part of that. But the special education
Yes.
lawsuit persisted. It actually
Yes.
persisted for 26 years. And we had hearing after hearing. There was a federal monitor who was sent in representing the judges, and we had a variety of federal judges who retired, and that suit was passed on to the next federal judge, and we made huge progress, but it was very time-consuming to work in terms of the nuances of that lawsuit, which were huge. I mean, we had a room from floor to ceiling stacked with depositions
Good grief.
and investigative material, etc. So I actually worked up to the point of the settlement of the lawsuit. So, you know, that was very rewarding. And as state superintendent, I had a team of people second to none, and made some requirements that impact this university and every other teacher preparation institution in the state of Maryland, and that is the professional development school experience, which had to be 100 days, because I believe you cannot be a good teacher if you don't really understand what it's like in a real school with real children. I was proud that we elevated Maryland's performance in a variety of categories to be #1 in the nation over time, that we were the highest performing state for advanced placement as determined by the College Board for the percentage of students taking and passing with a 3, 4, or 5 advanced placement. and redesigned all of teacher preparation as state superintendent, working with a team of really talented people, both from institutions of higher ed as well as the State Department of Education. So then I worked with Governor Ehrlich and then Governor O'Malley. Governor O'Malley and I were not good. We had started out as very good friends when he was the mayor, but I had a very strong commitment to accountability. Accountability of our schools to provide an education for children. And I looked at 11 schools in Baltimore City, which in fact had virtually none of the children passing a state test. And I looked at the poverty levels of those children, and education would be the only ticket in their lives that could give them a better place as citizens, as self-supporting individuals. And I wanted to not take over the schools, as the press like to say. I didn't have the authority to take over those schools, but to force the system to reinvent those schools. And Governor O'Malley saw that as doing something positive for Governor Ehrlich. There was a lot of competition there. Governor Ehrlich was still the governor. So when Governor O'Malley became the governor, he did not want me to be in this position because he was very angry about that action, which he actually had blocked through the legislature and like the last couple days at 9 o'clock at night. So he said that he felt that we did not have a good relationship and that I ought to leave. And at that point, of course, I could have retired. I could have done a variety of other things. But I remembered the principle of not subjecting education to partisan politics, and that children are not Democrats or Republicans, they're children. They deserve our collective best efforts. And I said, I'm not doing that. And there was a standoff for a long time, but the citizens realized that this could be a dangerous road for education. And it wasn't so much about me. It was about the integrity of education in this state. And I always said it wasn't about me. I didn't need a job. My husband's been very successful. And even he said, why don't you just leave? Why do you want to put up with this pressure? I wanted to stand for a principle that I believe is incredibly important. And so finally, he said, you know, we'll have to get along and I'll have a press conference and we'll work together collaboratively.
Did that happen?
To an extent. I mean, it was much more, it was better than it had been, so the public wouldn't have noticed anything, but privately there was still tremendous resentment. But I just was determined to do my job, and things were going well, and he recognized that because on his watch it was very positive. So, but you know, I think if you're going to serve as a model for children, you have to stand for principles. And, you know, it isn't always easy to do that. And if I had felt I had been wrong, I had done something wrong, I think I would have left. But I felt that my only interest was in the future of those children and their opportunities. And that wasn't wrong. That's what every educator should care about. So anyway, that was that. After 20 years, I said, I do think it's time. And it was probably the longest tenure of an appointed superintendent in the nation. So I said, I want to do something different. But I did want a little hiatus of time, and that's when there was outreach from Towson University and what I consider coming here. There was outreach from Johns Hopkins University. But I always felt my roots were here at Towson. I've admired the fact that there was never any recoiling at this university from the fact that education and the preparation of teachers is the primary mission of this university, and I love that. And I really want to elevate the status of education. I mean, there's no other profession that's possible without education. So teachers are fundamental to every other profession. And yet I don't think, in the eyes of many people, it is the respected profession that it needs to be. So I would summarize by saying that I've had an incredible career with incredible opportunity, incredible learning, incredible challenges. It all really began here at Towson University, and in some ways it was sort of divine intervention that I had the hearing loss, that I couldn't go on to Smith College, that I was here, and it has served me so well. And yet I think that the challenge I see now is that as everything in the world evolves, so does education. Mm-hmm. And how do we keep ourselves on the cutting edge of what is in the best interest for our students? And students fundamentally don't change, but their way they learn, the environment they're in from a learning perspective changes. And it has changed. When I came here to Towson, no one knew what an iPhone was. You had a calendar. You wrote down the dates of your obligations. I mean, I wouldn't think of that today. I put it in my iPhone. Uh-huh. So we have to be commensurate with all of those changes to be on the cutting edge and to maintain the quality that this institution represents. So I have a great story, and I've had great experiences.
Could you tell us a little bit about the kinds of things you're doing as the Presidential Scholar at Towson, what you see your role as, and
Well, it's interesting. When I was offered the position as Presidential Scholar, which I really love the term, but it was not a defined position. The thing that was appealing to me was access to the entire campus. Yes. And not to reside in only one part of the School of Education. Uh-huh. Not that I don't have high regard for the School of Education, but I believe education and preparation of our teachers can take place across this campus.
And it does.
And it does. And so as I began to interpret the position for myself, I knew that there were a couple things I wanted to immediately pursue. Mm-hmm. One was that we live in a state where science and technology and engineering are very critical because of the industries we have in this state. And I happen to be fortunate to serve on the National Math and Science Initiative Board. Mm-hmm. Many people associate that with the Exxon advertisements, uh-huh. et cetera. And I'm very fortunate to be among very distinguished people on that board. And I saw that other states were applying for a grant which prepares teachers in science and math. And I was eager for Maryland to be, since I'm on the board and since I think it's an important initiative and that the funding is very good, I was eager for Maryland to be able to have one of these grants. And I couldn't think of a better place than Towson. And so thanks to the people who worked on the proposal, we were granted the first You Teach grant for math and science in the state of Maryland. And that resides in the Fisher College of Math and Science, mm-hmm. which certainly has affiliation with the College of Education. Of but it is predominantly the opportunity for these students to be able to move forward and really be the premier people in school systems teaching math and science. Uh-huh. So that was number one. Number two, I have a great interest in the arts. I believe the arts teach more than anything else the whole notion of performance, not just learning, but how do you perform? How do you apply what you've learned to do critical thinking? And in a lot of ways, the integration of information in performance, whether that's the visual arts or the performing arts. And so, and I'm a harp student at the Peabody, so I have a lot of interest in the arts. And I knew that Towson, because I had worked with them on being on the cutting edge of the certification as in arts integration for people who were willing to come back and take that additional work. And these are not people to replace the music teacher or the art teacher, but in a sense, regular teachers who are going to profit from the skills of the arts in teaching their children. And so working to elevate that to a master's level, working with the dean in that college. And then I developed a very significant interest in the fact that Maryland had such an incredible track record in advanced placement, which I had been a huge proponent with our local superintendents. But then I thought, you know, we always have seasoned teachers, and that's a nice word for people who may be getting ready to retire, teaching advanced placement. And what if we could marry our teachers, who it's a very select group of math and science people, and have them prepared when they exit this university and be endorsed by the State Department of Education as qualified to teach advanced placement in math and science. And so I'm working on a proposal with the College Board. We would be the only university in the nation to be able to offer this pre-service group the training necessary to be endorsed as advanced placement teachers. And that they will be gobbled up the minute they get that diploma from here. Then I'm very interested in opening the world to hear the positions of many different kinds of people and how it affects our children, our society, education. And so I've started the series of signature forums. As a matter of fact, had one yesterday with the former police commissioner, Frederick Bielfeld. But I had Dr. Ben Carson come to talk about the neurology of learning as a neurosurgeon. And then Dr. Martha Dankla from the Kennedy-Krieger Institute talking about neuropsychiatry, neuroscience, and how that impacts the learning of children. And I will have other prominent people coming to this campus, which draws people from all over the state of Maryland in these signature programs. But then I decided working 3 days a week at Towson University wasn't enough. I'm going to work at Kennedy-Krieger. They offered me a position to establish a fellowship program for people in special education. And what this will do is to provide a year-long fellowship working with the incredible researchers at Kennedy-Krieger. And then the people who matriculate through this year will have a certification in administration that will come from Towson University. So it's a partnership.
Wonderful.
The didactic part of it will come from Kennedy-Krieger. The certification and requirements of that certification will come from Towson University. And we're marrying it together. And so when these people leave, they will be the future leaders in special education at the school level and at the system level. So that's another innovation. And I've only been here a year. So it's been an exciting time.
Certainly
And
has.
I really want to say something about Dr. Lusky and this university. Everyone has been incredibly supportive. And everyone has been excited by the idea of these changes. And it is not to say that there is anything inferior about this university or the programs. That is not the point. The point is continuous improvement. And that's what we say in our schools. That's what we have to say as a society, that there has to be continuous improvement if we're to maintain the status of excellence.
Absolutely.
So,
one last question. I think perhaps my only question, or only my second question, is what would you say, what wisdom would you share with individuals who are considering teaching as a career, as a life choice?
I am dedicated to the idea of education. As I've said, it is the thing that makes every other profession possible. It is the joy of really being a creative artist in human lives. And I can't think of a better profession, a more rewarding profession, to think that you've influenced in whatever direction that child may take in the future, you've influenced that life. And I've often had this discussion with Dr. Carson, who's a wonderful friend. Who's more important in terms of the cognitive development? Is it the neuropsychologist? Is it the neurosurgeon? Or is it the teacher? And he's really agreed with me that the teachers are responsible for the cognitive development of a child every single day, in every single interaction. And that is sustained over time with great teachers. So it is the most important profession in our society. And I just really hope, I've traveled internationally. I've spent a lot of time in countries like Taiwan, working with them on benchmarking some of the things that we do in this country, because they have an excellent school system with great outcomes. So I've been benchmarking with a country like Taiwan. Their teachers are the most revered people in the society. Mm-hmm. They pay no taxes. And so there's an affirmation of this critical importance of teachers. Parents bow to the teachers in coming into the classroom. So I do think our society has some things to learn about the importance and value of education.
Anything else that we've forgotten? I mean, this is such a small snippet of your extensive career, and there are things that I would love to have you continue to talk about, but is there anything from your perspective that you want to say that you haven't thought of or I haven't asked?
Well, there's an aha moment, hearing the President's State of the Union message when he talked about the importance of early childhood. I have been a strong proponent of very high quality early childhood investment for years and years and years. So I'll end with this story. Maybe 15 years ago, I was asked to speak to a group of CEOs of very large businesses in Maryland. And I said if I were queen for a day, I would put all my money in early childhood and cut out the senior year of high school. You could have heard the moans in the office, in that audience rather. And the fact of the matter is that today people are recognizing the potential of this investment in young children at a very early age, and what difference it will make for the whole trajectory of their educational experience. So it was an aha moment.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.